We've already mentioned a little bit about this before, but we're going to go over it again just to be safe, and that's the constructor of our class. So the whole purpose of our constructor is to be able to initialize all the attributes of our class. Because if we have these attributes declared, they have to have some initial value. So the constructor allows us to do that. Now there are two different types of constructors that we can have in our class. We can have one that's called the default constructor, which just simply means that there are no parameters. So these would be the default values for all the attributes in our class. The second type would be a constructor with parameters, which means we would pass some values, and these would be the initial values of all of our attributes in the class. Here is an example of a default constructor for the employee class. So here we have public sub new, and since it's a default constructor, there are no parameters included in the parentheses. And we see that we just set default values for our pay rate and name properties. I'll mention that in just a little bit. So we're going to set the pay rate to 0. We're going to set name to the empty string, and then we end it with end sub. So there are a couple things here that I do want to mention that you may be wondering. First of all, the name of the constructor is new, not the name of the class. We might have been initially asking, is new a typo? And it's not. Even though we use employee as the constructor that we call whenever we instantiate the object, the way it's defined in our class is we use new instead of employee. This is just a visual basic thing. I'm actually not so sure why it wouldn't be public sub employee, but the way they do it is whenever a constructor is defined, it uses public sub new instead of public sub employee. I think part of it is just because new is the keyword for the constructor. The other thing I should mention is that we can use the names of our properties instead of the names of the attributes. So what we're doing here is, even though we're setting pay rate to 0, that pay rate is the property pay rate, not the underscore DBL pay rate from our attribute. So what this does is it's actually going to call our set operator for pay rate, and it's going to store the value 0 for our pay rate attribute. Same thing goes for our name. We would call the set operator for our name property, and that's going to set the name of the employee to the empty string. So what happens is we have our properties defined for our attributes, and then when we actually use the attributes in all of our sub procedures, instead of directly using the attributes, we actually use the properties instead. Here's an example of a constructor where we're actually passing parameters. So we still have public sub new because that's how we define our constructor. And then notice that we have two parameters in here. We have ename, which is a string, and then ePayRate, which is a double. These are bival parameters. We're not doing any changes to the parameters themselves. And we see that we set pay rate to ePayRate and name to ename. Remember, the way this works is that means we're going to set the pay rate attribute to whatever is stored in ePayRate, and we're going to store the name attribute to be whatever the value of ename is. All that's left is to now create the sub procedures for our class. Now these should be set to public, that way we can directly access them. If we made them private, then no other class would be able to access or call that particular sub procedure. Now with that said, there are circumstances where you would want to have a sub procedure be private if you were having, for example, some internal procedure for making some changes and you wouldn't want to have other classes access that. But most of the time, we're going to have our subs be public. Now, these subs work just like any other sub. So everything we talked about before involving subs applies for the subs that are used in classes as well. And we also should mention, just like with our constructors, we can use the properties to indirectly use attributes, or we could just directly use the attributes themselves. Most of the time, we'll just use the properties and not mess with the actual attributes. That way we can let the properties take care of all the assigning and the retrieving of the values of the attributes. Here's an example of a function where we're going to compute the salary of an employee. So we have public function salary, and then we have parentheses in there. Nothing out of the ordinary. We end this with end function, just like any other function we would use in Visual Basic. And we see that we're going to return the hours times pay rate. And once again, notice that here we're actually going to be using the properties for the hours and pay rate attributes, and we're not directly using the hours or pay rate attributes. If we were doing them directly, we would have the underscore DBL hours and an underscore DBL pay rate. But we can use properties, and in fact, that's the common thing to do for getting and setting the values of our attributes. Once we've created our class, we can now work with the objects in our programs. So the first thing we have to do in Visual Basic is to create an object of the class. So we've seen that before. So we would declare an object variable, and then we would instantiate it. And then in order to use an attribute from that object, we'd have to indirectly use it with the property. So remember, the attributes themselves are private, so we can't directly access them using normal approaches, but we can indirectly access the attribute by accessing the property associated with that attribute. So let me give you an example here. Here's some code. The first line is creating an object of the employee class. So we have dim emp object as employee, and we set it equal to new employee. So this is going to call the default constructor. Remember, the constructor is defined as new, not employee. It's a Visual Basic thing. We'll just go with it. And then look at the next line. We have emp object.payrate equals 12.25. This is the equivalent of calling the set method in Java for that attribute. So what we're doing here is we're going to be going into the pay rate property. We would use the set operator and set the actual attribute, which would be underscore DBL pay rate, to 12.25. So this is how we would have to actually work with the attributes. Like I said, this is just like using any set method in Java in order to set the value of the attribute. It's just now we can use the properties instead of having to try to do some other approach.